regardless of your going in position, if students could think of themselves as participants and not consumers, and to go in with almost a service-minded and generative approach rather than a minimalist approach or not feeling part of something.
Here at the Veritas Forum, we love scholars. They're brilliant, amazing to work with, and possess so much wisdom and insight. Every time I hear a Veritas Forum event, I feel like I leave with new perspectives and great questions to discuss with friends. Usually, our interviews for the Veritas Forum podcast invite faculty to share their scholarship and research. Maybe through Veritas, you've learned about string theory, geometric combinatorics, or virtue ethics. But we're switching it up this episode. Yes, here at Veritas, we love scholars, but we also love the university. It's a unique place and time for inquiry and exploring the ideas that shape our lives. And at Veritas, we are fortunate to partner with students, faculty, and administrators as they pursue knowledge and truth. So today, we're sharing an interview that I did with one scholar about his unique perspective on the university. How does he see the pursuit of knowledge and truth on college campuses today? How does he imagine the university being a place where life's big questions are discussed, debated, and celebrated? Our guest today is legal scholar and university insider, Dr. John Inazu. He's the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University in St. Louis. John not only has university experience inside the classroom, from his undergrad degree, law degree, PhD, and a decade as a university professor, but he's also passionate about serving the university outside of the classroom. A few years ago, Dr. Inazu, along with other scholars, started the Carver Project at WashU to empower Christian faculty and students to serve and connect university, church, and society. Today, I talk with John about what it looks like to faithfully serve the university. We cover a lot of ground, from the state of university discourse, to the communication of mission, vision, and values, to how college students can best take advantage of their time on campus. And I'm so excited to share our conversation with you today. This is the Veritas Forum podcast, a place for generous dialogue about the ideas that shape our lives. I'm your host, Carly Regal, and I'm the podcast producer for the Veritas Forum, a Christian nonprofit that hosts conversations that matter across different worldviews. So, after you've done an undergraduate degree, a law degree, a master's, a PhD, and you've been working as a professor for many years, you spent literally decades in the university. And I'm sure that at some point over those many, many years, you've asked yourself the question, what is the university for? And I would love to start off our interview just to hear your thoughts on what's the purpose of the university.
Yeah, I have had a lot of time to think about this question. And I think I've, as you rattled through the time I've spent in the university, I've also thought about it from different disciplines. My undergraduate major was engineering, and then law and political science are also somewhat different fields. And so from the different vantages and disciplines, I think the collective enterprise of the university is about the search for truth and knowledge. And then there are some related and importantly related secondary goals and purposes, one of which I do think is to promote a kind of democratic citizenship that especially universities in the U.S. are part of what it means to be an active participant and citizen in this country. And then related to that is learning how to pursue difference and disagreement through the learning process and the search for truth and knowledge. And how do we do that well with people who think quite differently and with different power dynamics and different subject matters? And not that there are any easy answers to any of those questions, but I think that's the purpose and the point of the university.
In our discussion today, I really want to hone in on this element of seeking truth and discourse within that pursuit. I'm especially curious about competing truth claims. I guess I'm curious, how can we think about competing claims of truth? Who wins, or is there a winner in these situations?
Part of the pursuit of truth and the understanding of knowledge is a fuller grasp of truth and knowledge from, we might say, a more comprehensive vantage point. And then there are some truths that are not really about competition for ideas. If you take an introductory math class in college, you're not really going to debate how the equations work. You're just learning how the world operates. It's not to say that those are forever proven unchallengeable, but as far as we know from science and math today, they are. And then there are lots of other areas in the university where there are normative competing truth claims and people arguing for the integrity and goodness and morality and ethics of certain ideas. And in those cases, I don't think it's a matter of always finally knowing as much as being able and willing to ask questions and sharpen our own beliefs and perspectives from allowing them to engage with and be challenged by other perspectives.
Yeah, I kind of had my feet in both worlds. I was a STEM major and I studied meteorology. So there are some interesting dynamics with like truth claims and what are the conditions for a cloud to precipitate? Like we talked about that more than you would think you would talk about it in meteorology. And then I had a second major of communication, which was definitely more of the like, what are strategies for persuading that are ethical? What are strategies for introducing new information to someone who may not be super familiar with the topic?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, first, I want to say your comment about your meteorology class made me remember a class I took in undergraduate called sediment transport, where the entire semester was how dirt moves, right? So you can have these kinds of
Yes.
classes, but I would say in either a STEM focused science class or a more normative humanities class, in both cases, you're bounding the terms of the debate. So in sediment transport, we're not talking about whether Martians come and move the dirt because it's just not a relevant question to the discourse that we're having. In the same way, in a normative politics or law class, we're not talking about is Nazism a good alternative to be thinking about because it's just an out of bounds question for the debate that we're having. So I don't think there's a sharp line between how a teacher or a class or a society has to bound debate in order to have coherence to the ongoing discussion. I think of law often as scaffolding. You have to learn really well the background doctrine, and when you get to specific cases, you have to learn the facts very well. But then you've got to be able to argue about the gray areas that that doctrine and those facts produce. And it turns out once you get very sophisticated at the law, you've got to know all the background. That's the scaffolding, but you really, in some ways, let it go. And then you're arguing in the gray areas. And so for an introductory law class or to a first year law student, so much of the labor is learning the basic doctrine and learning the facts of different cases. But really, that's just kind of, learning the 101 stuff so that you can actually get creative and imaginative. Actually, it comes to mind, I co-teach a class called Law, Race, and Design, and my co-teacher is a graphic designer. And so it's the intersection of law and human-centered design. And one of the premises that we have to disabuse our students of is that law is a set of fixed rules with no creativity, and art and design is all creativity with no rules, because of course both disciplines have both. And in order to think well and do well in either art or law, you have to be both an expert in the rules of the game and a creative and imaginative thinker.
I was thinking kind of in the language of like boundaries or constraints on discourse or how you approach a problem. I don't know if this is kind of an absurd example or maybe this question is a bit too theoretical. But say that I was in that sediment transfer class and at some point there was this new scientific discovery, this new paper that came out that established some sort of credibility to the fact that there might be Martians actually coming in and moving dirt. Maybe there's just one peer-reviewed article that suggests that. I guess I'm curious, when it comes to moving these boundaries, what is the weight of the evidence that need, like, how much proof do you need and what sort of proof do you need to change?
Yeah, I think this is somewhat contingent on the state of the learner or the level of education. So I don't think if you've got one peer-reviewed paper about the Martians, I don't think you want to bring that into second grade science class. But you might have a couple of postdocs start to think about the question with their advisor. And I think in the best sense, this is how the scientific community works. It applies rigorous thinking, and then it allows heterodox ideas and new theories to come into play and engage with the existing community. And then there are discussions about whether and how that fits into the status quo paradigms. And I think one consequence of that is that learning and inquiry is intrinsically dynamic and somewhat unstable. It has to be open to these disruptions. And that's for some people unnerving, but for a lot of people very exciting. I can think of an upper level undergraduate seminar where you might throw out big ideas of political theory that are not mainstream to get people to think differently and to question underlying priors. But that same class doesn't work with 18-year-olds coming in for their first year of college. And so there's a kind of prudence to teaching that lies behind all of this, and identifying and knowing the relevant community of discourse within which these conversations unfold.
I'm curious about the administrative elements of shifting boundaries for plausible discourse. It's one thing for one professor to decide with a cohort of researchers to shift the direction of the research. It's another thing for the administration of a university or a couple of provosts. I don't even know what a provost does, but some higher ups in the university to decide, hey, this is the direction that we're going to go. This is more of a codified scaffolding or boundary that we're going to put in all of our sediment transfer classes for the next 5 years. I guess I'm curious what you would say to the more like university level decisions in that regard.
Yeah, I think the first step there is to disentangle different kinds and different levels of institutions. The university writ large is its own kind of institution managed by administrators who play certain roles and have certain skill sets, and a classroom or a department or an academic discipline is in some ways it's a sub institution. It could be a cross institution, but it's something different than the broader university. And in the classroom setting, whether we're talking about second graders or postdocs, I think so much of this comes down to a very fundamental question of trust. Do the students with relatively less education than the professor, or at least hopefully in most circumstances, do the students trust the professor to guide them in an appropriately age-specific and skill-specific discussion, and push them in the right ways and not push them beyond where they're supposed to be? And that's an element of a function of trust in the classroom. Once you abstract that to a higher level of institution, you can already see part of the problem. Who trusts the provost? Well, nobody knows what the provost does or who the provost is. It's very hard to establish relational trust, and yet you still need some basic institutional policy. So your broader institution is going to have a policy about academic freedom, and it's going to have a policy about plagiarism, and it's going to have a policy about sexual assault. But it's not, if it starts to micromanage what discussions happen in classrooms and in specific disciplines, then I think part of the answer is the institution is not actually functioning at its best or healthiest state, and it ends up compromising or complicating some of the sub-institutions within it.
Hmm. I think in this general realm of the university having more of this top down approach to discourse in individual classes, I guess the thing that really comes to mind is the notion of like a religious university or a explicitly Christian university. Some universities take very strong public stances of truth. I guess I'm curious, is it possible to have a neutral university when it comes to stances about truth and stances about pursuing truth and what that looks like?
I don't think there's anything like the neutral university. I think you can have instead greater or lesser degrees of clarity of purpose and mission. So you mentioned religious institutions, religious universities. They're a subset of the mission specific universities, but they're not the only ones. Think about the flagship state schools. The University of North Carolina could, from the top down, say that all of its departments and classes exist primarily not only for the pursuit of knowledge, but for the benefit of the people of North Carolina. And that could affect all kinds of pedagogical, curricular, and hiring decisions. The graduate arm of the Air Force, Air University, has a top down mission and purpose that it assigns to all of its classes, and it affects the culture of the place. But I think the point with these examples is the more mission specific you can be and the more clearly you can name your goals from the top, then those goals will make sense as they trickle down to lower levels of the institution. Now, that only works, going back to the earlier point about trust, that only works if you have institutional trust and buy-in at all levels. And this is one thing I've seen in so many different academic and non-academic contexts. You get a bunch of very motivated and impassioned leaders who think they've settled on the purpose, mission, and values of the organization. And they spend a lot of time coming up with an agenda or a mission statement or a strategic plan. And they just assume that the rest of the organization is alongside them, when in fact, no one else has been brought along the process. No one else maybe even cares. And you certainly don't have the thick relational buy-in you need for success. So unless there's an ongoing conversation, and probably in the best form, a set of practices and rituals and liturgies that bring the institution as a whole together and at all levels to reinforce what mission, purpose, and values are, it's going to be very hard for institutional leaders to instill that culture at lower levels of the organization. So what you have instead are these vacuous, expressive, performative statements that come out from institutional leaders to say, we are about such and such, or we really care about this. And nobody ever believes that the institution as a whole actually thinks that. There's just some speechwriter or assistant to the university president who feels compelled to issue a statement. It's amazing to me how thin those statements of culture really are when you walk around a place and you realize, no, nobody actually thinks or believes this. No one even prioritizes it because there's no collective sense of identity or culture.
I'm thinking on this element of institutional trust and buy-in from all levels of the university. I'm curious, for those who are listening to this podcast who might currently be students, when you think about buy-in from a professor to the general mission and vision and goals of a university, that makes a lot of sense because the university is paying them. You would want to be generally aligned with whatever workplace you're a part of. I guess I'm curious from a student standpoint, if I'm a student at a university, do I need to agree with the mission, vision, and values of that university?
Well, I like the question. A couple of things to say about that. One, it depends on what the university is. If the university expects you to be part of its culture and its mission and values, then and if they advertise that going in, then you should sign up for it. You should be there precisely because of that, not in spite of it. But I think regardless of whether a particular student is there principally for the mission, or perhaps, maybe it's other reasons, you're on a sports team or you wanted to be in the sorority or whatever it was, that regardless of your going in position, if students could think of themselves as participants and not consumers. So, what does it mean to be a co participant in the pursuit and acquisition of knowledge and the creation of community and the engagement with discourse over your 4 or 7 or however many years you're part of that institution, and to go in with a almost a service minded and generative approach rather than a minimalist approach or not feeling part of something. And then I think a related piece to this, and this is true not just for students, but for faculty and everyone else, to realize that the university as an institution is such a massive ecosystem with so many different relevant constituents. So, yes, students are important, but so are faculty, and so are administrators and alumni and trustees and donors, and in some instances, politicians and all kinds of people who are trying to weigh in on something. And I think we get in this limited mindset that we are the most, whoever we are the most important constituency. And when a decision is reached that we don't like or is not in our interest, we throw up our hands and wonder what's the point of this institution, when in fact there could be very sophisticated reasons balancing the interests of other constituents. Now, having said that, I'm no fan of the current state of many universities, especially elite ones, and the amount of focus they place on growing endowments and satisfying donor relations and those sorts of things. I mean, it seems to me that many of the top nonprofit universities are effectively for profits, and their decision making and their culture is about generating revenue. And that's not a, well, that's not a very inspiring goal or mission.
Kind of taking a step back from the student or even faculty interaction with the university, there's been a lot of talk in the past, I don't know, 5, 6 years about the role of guest speakers or people who visit campuses to, give a lecture. And I guess I'm curious, if someone who comes in to a university to give a talk, how much buy-in should an individual coming for a lecture have with the university's mission, purpose, and values?
Yeah, and so again, this will sound like a broken record, but it depends on what the university says its purpose is, and some universities will want strong alignment, and others will have far fewer requirements for alignment. I think it's important to recognize that that person probably doesn't need the same kind of buy-in. Certainly, is not embedded in the same conversations that emerge over time, and likely doesn't know people as well in those settings. But I do think that even in those outside speaker contexts, a university or higher ed institution that knows its purpose is going to set some constraints, not only on who comes, but their mode of discourse and way of engagement. So in the past few years, we've seen some headlines about this, is particularly from conservative speakers who are brought in to prove a point, a comedian or someone who's known to be quite boisterous and uncharitable. And the whole shtick is to bring the person in, advertise them heavily, and anticipate this outrageous performance. And I mean, that's just not my sense of what the university is about. And if you're trying to engage with ideas in the pursuit of knowledge, bring in someone really smart and less flashy who's able to play by the rules of the game of the university. That doesn't mean that they surrender their viewpoints or their own academic inquiry, but it means they're going to ask questions and engage well instead of trying to be theatrical or performative. You didn't ask this, but to me, it somewhat naturally leads to the diversification and commodification of higher ed, so that these days it's also about semi-professional sports at a lot of these institutions, or bringing in, really headline performers and concerts, or creating really amazing and intense social experiences. I mean, I don't know. Like at some point you got to make your place interesting, but the more you commodify and diversify the entertainment piece of the university, the less you're hewing to the fundamental purposes of the institution.
And I think also that if we want students to see the university as a place of participation rather than a place of consumption, maybe smoothie bars are encouraging more consumption and less participation.
No, that's a great point. That's a great point, right? And really, actually, there's got to be something. I mean, I'm sure these institutions exist, but there's something between the detached experience of the commuter school, where it's so hard to form a sense of collective identity or even shared ongoing relationships because people are zipping in and out from all kinds of responsibilities and they're not living proximate to each other. That's on the one end of the spectrum. And on the other end are these expensive social clubs at the higher end universities where no stone is left unturned and no expense sacrificed to have the ultimate experience. And both of those are in very different ways distract from the potential and the opportunity that exists when you bring people together in close proximity for a number of years to think, study, and learn and grow. And I think there's got to be a sweet spot between those two.
Just as you've been talking, I think the word that's been coming to mind is hospitality. When we think about the university and there are certain mission values, just think about like your own house. Like within your house, you have certain rules. There are things that can be done, things that can't be done. But hopefully, also in your house, there is some sort of policy for people outside of your house to be able to be brought in. And yes, there's limits on what those people are to do when they're in your house, and maybe even certain areas of your house that they are not allowed to go into. And I guess I'm curious, if you're thinking about the university today, what would it look like for these huge institutions to become hospitable places?
Hmm. Well, in some ways, when you look at the state of higher education in the last 50 years and the shift from the principal relational component being faculty driven to administratively provided, the student services wing of the university, which has just exploded in the last few decades, and the number of non-faculty staff who live in the dorms and run programs and are there to provide mental health counseling and other sorts of services. They're all kind of there as a proxy for what you're describing as hospitality, but there's something really bureaucratic about it also. And there's a detachment, and a lot of faculty feel this tension too. And honestly, it's not an easy question to think through because on the one hand, it frees faculty to do lots of other things they want to do, like research and other kinds of engagement. But the faculty of 100 years ago were situated much differently with respect to their students, and they did perform this more holistic, almost mentoring role for their students. And so I think about, we happen to live very close to campus. It's across the street, and it's just a couple of minutes into my office. So when we have students to our house, that fundamentally transforms the relational dynamic I have with my students, because now they're not sitting in my pristine office looking at my bookcases, but they're seeing my kids' toys strewn around on the floor and, maybe some jackets and shoes shoved in the corner, and people are screaming and running around. And it's just a very different, unpolished environment. But I think that's kind of a form of hospitality in a weird way, too. It's the kind that says you can come see. Everything doesn't have to be the smoothie bar and the freshly painted room, but you can actually see a more authentic form of living. And so now I'm just kind of thinking through this as we're talking, but the splintering of roles in higher ed, where all of student affairs goes and does the student side of things with the students in the dorms, and faculty aren't around the dorms, but we're in our offices and we're all crammed into these very limited and somewhat artificial roles. So it means we've got to do a lot more work to remind each other that we are whole people who have lots of other dimensions of our lives. I sometimes tell my students, don't forget faculty are people too, right? I have I have bad days and I miss deadlines and I'm grumpy sometimes and I don't get everything right. And I also understand that students have bad days and aren't always going to be on the top of their game. And that if we can have a mutual grace and trust, that doesn't mean mediocrity, but it means recognizing humanity.
Yeah. I feel like this recognition of humanity, seeing others as whole people. I mean, as a Christian, like, who did this the best? Like, that's Christ, inviting people to come as they are, to be present with them. When we think about vision, mission, values, as someone who is a Christian, but not necessarily at a Christian university, what do you think the Christian tradition brings to this conversation?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. I love where I work. I love the students. I love my colleagues. I'm really grateful for the resources that we have that let me do all kinds of things. And I also think that schools like mine are very unlikely to recover clear purpose, mission, or values anytime soon. So part of my sense as a Christian is just recognizing this is a tremendous and privileged opportunity, but it's not like I'm going to reshape the institution. And so, can I be grateful for the institution, for the opportunities it provides with all of its problems and challenges, and then do my best to love it well and serve it well and the people in it. And then I think a related point where there is, I think, a lot of scriptural wisdom is, and this is true for I think everyone, not just Christians in higher ed, but Christians anywhere, that we're existing and living in a world or a set of institutions that we don't fully control. We're not going to control. That's okay. We're resident aliens in a sense. We're passing through this life. Our citizenship is in heaven. These are all, very well-known scriptural assertions. And that should free us to say, this isn't about us. We're part of a very long story. We're here for a season. We have around us these complicated, good and broken institutions that aren't themselves Christian. And we're not, I mean, God is not relying on us to fix them. He's relying on us to be faithful within them. And I think that posture, at least for me, has freed me to be more of who I am without worrying entirely that all of this depends on me.
Mm. I love that line that God isn't relying on us to be fixing the university. He's asking us to be faithful. Um, I feel like that's a great segue to some last questions on this interview. I'm especially curious for your advice for maybe the listener who's a Christian, who's a student, professor, administrator at a non Christian institution. Do you have any advice for them on how to navigate like what is and isn't discussed in their classrooms or how they think about the purpose of the university?
Well, I think there's a measure of prudence in thinking through how to engage with ideas or how to press certain issues. So we're not called to be God's spokesperson for every single issue that crosses our paths. And I think about this in my own life sometimes. Whenever I get on social media, I'm constantly annoyed by almost everything I see. And I've got to remind myself, I'm actually not called to respond to every annoying comment or every wrong statement about the law or anything else. That there are plenty of people who can do that. And my role, my expertise, my time, the stewardship of my time is better spent elsewhere. And I think there's a similar principle when you're in the learning environment that when you hear something you don't like or when you think of you as either not fully represented or poorly represented, it's not always incumbent upon you to try and fix it or correct it. Sometimes it's just listening and thinking more comprehensively about what you're learning and hearing. And, in the other direction, sometimes there are very clear times when you've got to stand up for what you know to be true. I think this is especially the case when you see someone around you who lacks power being abused or marginalized. And I think for Christians who have some form of power in these institutions, and that's often going to be faculty, one way to discern when you're supposed to spend your capital or engage is if you see the institution or people within the institution abusing power in ways that are harming people without power. And that's often not going to be you. It's going to be someone around you who you need to intervene on behalf of.
My final application question. I really love this transition from consumer to participant when thinking about the student experience. Do you have any ideas or suggestions for maybe someone who's listening is a current undergrad and maybe they, every Sunday, that brunch in the dining hall with those very, very good pancakes, they're thinking about how that was a major part of their decision to go to such and such school. I guess I'm curious, do you have any suggestions or ideas on how a listener might be able to shift from consumer to participant?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind, to return to an earlier theme from our discussion, is to take risks toward hospitality, regardless of what state you're in or what role you play. So I remember I sometimes share this story with students that when I was a college student, I would show up at church and wait for all the older people with kids to come talk to me because, they're the people of the church and I'm just this college student. And I would be frustrated when people wouldn't take the initiative. And now that I'm the older person with kids, I look at the college students and say, why aren't they coming to talk to me? They're the fun college students. And so I think all of us are sort of positioned to think we're not the initiators of hospitality. And so what would it look like for a Christian student listening to this podcast to say, how can I be of service to certainly other students around me, but maybe a faculty member, maybe I invite someone to lunch or an administrator. Now, the caution here is nobody that I know of who's a faculty member or administrator is just looking to kill time. So put a little thought into what it could look like. But there are ways, I think, creatively to express a desire for hospitality and relationship that doesn't always have to start with the institution or the formal structures, that can be adjacent to it, that can just recognize the common human dimension of the people around us and know that we're kind of all in this together in some way.
Thanks for listening to this Winterlude episode of the Veritas Forum podcast. Next month, we're sharing another interview as we wait for the 12th season of the Veritas Forum podcast to drop in February of 2023. We'll be talking with Dr. Lydia Dugdale, a medical ethicist, practicing physician, and med school professor at Columbia, about medicine as a moral profession. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, take a second to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. We love hearing from you. Our production is led by me, Carly Regal, and the team at Resonate Recordings. Thanks to Bethany Jenkins and Seth Bollinger for providing content editing and audio support for this episode, and to Heather Beloga for coordinating all of our production needs. Thanks to our guest, Dr. John Inazu. It was great getting to sit down with you and discuss everything from smoothie bars and Martians moving dirt to the purpose of the university and how we can better contribute to the institutions in our lives. Listeners, be sure to check out Dr. Inazu's Substack, Some Assembly Required, and his most recent book, Uncommon Ground. Links to both of them are in the podcast description. Thanks also to our incredible partners who help support Veritas and make sure these conversations are possible. And a final thanks goes to you, the listener. Thanks for listening as we explore the ideas that shape our lives.